Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Anya Leonard. I am the founder and director of Classical Wisdom. If you're new to Classical Wisdom, we are a site dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. And I'm very excited today to have a very interesting conversation on the nature of the gods. And I think it's a really, really important conversation. And I feel like I'm a bit repetitive because I know my audience well enough to know that I probably don't need to say this, but just in case, I would love to say that everyone please come in with the spirit of open-mindedness. We're off in the quest of truth and inquiry, and that means no topic is off the table. And I'm actually going to quote Cicero from George's excellent translation on the nature of gods when he says, "My intention is to be a fair and unbiased listener. I am not at all constrained by some knee-jerk reflective duty to endorse a predetermined view." So I think that will be an excellent spirit in which to enter this, no doubt, fascinating conversation. I'm going to first introduce our esteemed guests, and then they will start off the conversation, and we will be taking questions throughout in the chat. And we will have a dedicated Q&A near the end. So to begin, Michael Fontaine is the professor and associate vice professor of undergraduate education at the Department of Classics at Cornell University, New York, and the author of many books and articles. He has contributed to countless publications, including Forbes, The Spectator, The Daily Beast, The Times Literary Supplement, The Daily Mail, The Wine Spectator. He's the author of several publications, such as How to Tell a Joke, Pig Wars, How to Drink, The Classical Guide of Imbibing, as well as How to Grieve, An Ancient Guide to the Lost Art, and has been a regular in the Classical Wisdom events. So we always enjoy having Mike here with us. And we're also very happy to have, as a newcomer to Classical Wisdom, George Thomas, who's also Quintus Curtius and the translator of the most this excellent, very readable, very enjoyable translation on the nature of gods. And this is an excellent work. I highly recommend. It's just released. But I'm going to turn over to Mike, and he is going to do a more proper introduction to George, and I will get out of you.
Thank you very much, Anya, and hi, everybody. It's great to do another event here with Classical Wisdom. It's a real pleasure for me to introduce our translator for you today. And I want to give you a little bit of background. So I'm a professor of classics. That's the day job. I've been doing this a long time. And back around 2015, 16, somewhere around there, somebody said, "Have you heard there's some guy out there translating Cicero all by himself? He's not an academic. We don't really know anything about it. He's got some pseudonym." And so I was given the mandate to go check this stuff out and see what's going on. But lo and behold, I found my way to George Thomas, who's with us today. What I've since learned is that George went to MIT as an undergraduate and was then an officer in the Marine Corps for a number of years. Since then, he's gone on to become a trial attorney, and that's what he does as his own day job. And I think actually that has a lot to do, a very significant amount to do with the success of his project. But somehow during the day, he finds time to translate Latin, classical Latin, into magnificent English prose. He is, I think, without any hesitation, the best translator we have in the English-speaking world today for this stuff. He has sort of led the Cicero revolution, taking Cicero as a serious thinker in his ethics and his philosophy and his commitment to patriotism and political commitments. And, that's, for me, it was a real surprise, because when I got to grad school way back when, everybody said, "Oh, don't read Cicero. His philosophy is derivative and he doesn't really have anything new to say." And so, when everybody who's older than you tells you that, you just say, "Okay, I guess that's true." But it's totally wrong. So I have since become a huge apostle for George's translations. He's done most influentially, I think, the On Duties of Cicero, which is great. I've been teaching it in classes here for many years now. Last year or a year before, I think it was the Tusculan Disputations, which is Cicero's guide to mental health and how to get a grip and prioritize, what's most important to you in life. He's done a number of other works by Cicero. He's also done Sallust. He's done Cornelius Nepos, and so on. These are all fantastic books. And so that's my intro for you, George. And before I let you speak, I want to give a little tiny bit of background about today's latest work. It's brand new, On the Nature of the Gods. And so this is a book whose title might right away make you think of Lucretius, if you've ever heard of On the Nature of Things. And that's going to be one of the contrasts Cicero might have had in mind. You know, what's the difference between a thing and a god? Cicero wrote this book toward the very end of his life in the year 45, when he was probably 60 something years old. As George puts it quite memorably in the introduction here, he was a hunted man. Cicero had been, as you may know, the most important guy in Rome in his day. He had sort of saved Roman society from a coup attempt, only to find, as Nepos could tell you, that the whole country turned against him. He was shamed into exile and so on. In the final years of his life, he wrote all this philosophy. And this particular book, he tackles the topic of the nature of the gods. What are the gods? Do they exist? And so on. So, George, the first question I'm going to ask you, I guess, is what this, what is the book about? How is it set up? But also, even before we get to that, I bet we're going to have some people on this call that say, the gods. Well, I don't believe in a bunch of polytheistic gods. I don't even know if I believe in God at all. Why would I read some theological stuff? Is this going to be a sermon batting me over the head, telling me how to live my life? Is that what the book is about, or can you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, first, Michael, let me say thank you for your very, very kind introductory remarks. I do appreciate it. And it's very happy to be here, and hopefully I can contribute to you and Anya's discussion here. But regarding the nature of the gods, a little bit about it. It's like many of Cicero's philosophical works. It's set up in dialogue form, which is a format he was comfortable with from the academic school with his Platonic influence. And it's basically it's a dialogue in 3 books, and it really deals with 4 basic subject categories. It does a short review of early Greek philosophy and the views of early Greek natural philosophers on the nature of the world and the cosmos. And then it has, in the first book, it deals with the Epicurean theological views, and then it discusses the Stoic theological views on the nature of the gods. And then finally, it offers a critique of both of those systems from the perspective of academic skepticism. There's a number of different interlocutors or speakers. I can talk about them if you think it's appropriate for me to do that. But essentially, it's a very relaxed. Anyone that's been to the Italian countryside can almost imagine this happening. Cicero is present during the dialogue, but he doesn't really take an active participatory role in it. It's held at the house or the villa of a gentleman named Caius Aurelius Cotta, Cotta. He was an actual person, and he was a man, a Roman politician and orator, who was about 18 years older than Cicero. He served as a consul and also a pontiff, but he's referred to as a pontiff in the dialogue. And from that, we can sort of give an estimate of the date of this imaginary dialogue. And there's 2 other speakers. There's an individual named Caius Velleius, Vellelleius, and he offers the Epicurean critique or the Epicurean view of the nature of the gods. And then there's a gentleman named Balbus. I believe it's Quintus Lucilius Balbus. I can look it up, but I'm pretty sure that's the and we know very little about these individuals. They apparently were real people, as far as we know, but we don't know really anything about them other than what we find in the text itself.
Can I ask you? So it almost sounds like a joke, doesn't it, George? So you have an Epicurean, a Stoic, and a skeptic walk into a Roman villa. And so, you said it's a dialogue. It is a dialogue, but I think a lot of us on this call are going to think of Socratic dialogues with a lot of give and take, like a Greek tragedy. But that's not really how it reads to me. And I wonder if you would agree with this idea that it seems more like a lawyer's brief. The Epicurean makes the best possible case, and then the Stoic immediately cross-examines that and just blows it to smithereens. And what's interesting for a lot of people here are going to be that in the third book, the Stoics are in the hot seat, and they finally have their ideas questioned. Do you think that's right, or would you?
I think it's a very great point, Michael. I think in many ways you could almost look upon this as three independent monologues rather than a dialogue. You've got one sort of stream of information from one perspective, one from another, and a third from another. I mean, Epicureanism, Stoicism, academicism. The Aristotelians were not really as popular as a school, but these were the three major schools of Cicero's day. So it was natural for him to treat these philosophical perspectives. And how he set up this dialogue, it's a lot less back and forth-ish, for lack of a better word, than say Tusculan Disputations is, or even On Moral Ends. And we could argue, or we can maybe debate the reasons for that. It may have been that Cicero just preferred it that way and felt that was more conducive to getting his point across, or it may have been that he really did not have time to revise the manuscript and polish it to a more complete form. We really don't know. But I think it works. I think probably in a subject like this, to have constant interruptions like, well, wait a minute, what do you think? What do you mean? No, how dare you say that? And then have a back and forth. It might detract a little bit from the flow of the dialogue, but it's debatable. But yes, it is. It's very, as you said, it's there is some scorching criticism and relentless hounding of certain perspectives that we find in the dialogue, which is in keeping with Cicero's style of engagement.
I want to ask you about one in particular, and I couldn't dismiss the thought from my head. And those of you on the call, tell us in the chat if you've ever heard this before. But my takeaway from book 2 is that this is the best summation of Stoic sort of physics and metaphysics, right? And a lot of us are familiar with the coping mechanisms that we get in Tusculan Disputations. If you're angry, if you're upset, But here, boy, you start reading the Stoic stuff, the most impressive, for lack of a better word, thing that comes across is their ardent belief in intelligent design. I haven't heard that term in a good 10 or 15 years, but it was a real culture war thing here, 20 years back under the Bush administration, they kept hearing about it. And they wanted to ban teaching that and everything as being religious. But here it is, a Stoic point of view, and the argument is going on at great length about how hands are clearly, they're here to help us. So,
even the stars, the planets, and the firmament, it's all was perfectly created as evidence of intelligence, and the world is living. Yeah, it's a very good point, Michael. I mean, we just don't, just by an accident of history, we don't have the original writings of Zeno of Citium. We don't have Chrysippus. We don't have Carneades. We have to really infer, early Stoic thought mainly from Cicero. As far as we know, this is the most complete statement of ancient theologies that has really come down to us. Now, that's not the only value of the book, but it is a repository of otherwise lost information. And just as you said, yes, there's this concept of I guess we'll talk about divine providence down the road, but
actually, talk about that now, right? Because
and it's a good. We've talked about this before. Stoicism has enjoyed a sort of a real renaissance of popularity in recent years, but you find that most of the people that really investigate the Stoic philosophy, they tend to really focus on ethics and neglect the physics and metaphysics of Stoicism, which are, in my view, I think just as interesting, and present some real challenges in terms of cultural diffusion, and at least in my view. I guess we can get to that in a minute, but the Stoics had a very advanced cosmology. We can agree with it or disagree with it, but it certainly is there. And frequently, this whole idea of divine providence is a major feature of the treatise. And we've talked about this, Michael. What does it mean? Well, divine providence. What is that? Well, it's this idea of a prescient superintending governance of the world or of the universe. It's the idea, basically it's divine governance with elements of prescience in it. And it really stems from the Stoic view that, the human soul is an emanation of an original creative divine architect. And we can have, that being the case, we have, that seems to suggest to the Stoic thinkers that we can have we can sort of know or divine the intent and will of a divine power. And this is where divination and ties into their belief. That kind of gets us into different areas, but the Stoics were also big believers in divination. The idea that we can use augurs and auguries and horoscope, but that's a very fascinating subject in itself. And I find it very interesting that Cicero took the view that, look, he served as an augur himself in his early career. That was a post that he held. I think he was fascinated by these things, but he certainly, and Cicero's treatise on divination talked about this, and he also touches on it in on the Republic, De Republica. He scorned divination, basically. He thought that it was nonsense. However, and this is where it gets very, very interesting, and shows his real sophistication as a political thinker. He still thought that it should be supported. He still thought that it should be respected because it was written into the Roman Constitution. The use of augurs and these types of fortune tellers, for lack of a better word, it was written into the Roman Constitution, and Cicero thought that the law should be respected, and that the respect for these institutions would serve as a check on the excesses of democracy. So you might say this is a very cynical view of religion, but it was one that's shared by many great thinkers and political figures in history. I think we can find analogies in many philosophers, even in a leader, say someone like Napoleon, who was certainly not a religious man himself, but he understood the importance of restoring the Catholic Church to its former prominence in France after the excesses of the Revolution. So again, this is getting us into different areas, but it's possible to believe in the importance of religious ritual and yet not actually believe literally in the rituals themselves. And this is a contradiction that many people find disconcerting.
I want to ask you about that, if I can, because book one is all about the Epicureans, what they have to say about the gods. And some people here with us may already know this, but Epicurus famously said, the gods exist. They just don't have anything to do with us. And people say, wait a minute, that doesn't sound very sincere. That sounds like you're trying not to get burned at the stake. And he never actually answered that on the record. But Cicero, so you would think what you just said, right? I mean, a person like me might think Cicero has some sympathy for Epicureanism. But as you and I have talked about it, he seems adamant that this is a destructive philosophy, that it's not a good thing for Romans to practice Epicureanism. And what are your thoughts on that, based on here or other things you've written and translated?
Absolutely, Michael. I think Cicero viewed, well, first of all, let's say that Cicero's critique of Epicureanism is valid in some points, but he also, I think, is unfair in other. It often does not show him at his best. I think he was correct in believing that their ethical system lent itself to abuses, but I think he unfortunately does misrepresent the atomic theories of the Epicureans. I think he completely dismisses it, which I think does not show him at his best. But his view of the Epicurean theology was basically that, look, your idea, the Epicurean idea of a god, where you've got this vague, nebulous god that sort of emanates atoms from films. It's so vague and it's so nebulous and so detached that it's really no god at all. And he basically wanted to say, look, just come out and say what you really think. We all know that you're materialists. We all know that you Epicureans you think there's nothing out there except atoms in the void. You're only presenting this theological exercise as a protective coloration to prevent yourselves from getting driven out of Athens or wherever. We all know what you really want.
Yeah.
And look, I think there's some validity to this criticism. So, but it's a mixed bag. I mean, Cicero, I think, like anyone, he was not perfect. He had some some of his criticisms of Epicureanism is ferocious and slashing. But I think, all in all, I think his primary concerns were for social order. I think that's how we really have to understand him as a political figure who was very much concerned with respect for the law and social order. And I think he felt that the Epicurean theology essentially destroyed all faith in the gods, because if we accept the atomic theory, then what do we have? We have basically nothing.
It's interesting you say that, especially that last part, right? Because as I understand it, Epicureanism is basically the secular humanist lifestyle today, right? I mean, this is what was sort of rediscovered in the Renaissance, more or less, is described in Stephen Greenblatt's book, The Swerve, the rediscovery of Lucretius. And when people started, they got the microscopes, they said the atomic theory makes better sense than some of these other ideas of where stuff is coming from. But the straight materialism doesn't get us from inert matter to anything alive, does it? Right? And that's where book 2 of On the Nature of the Gods is so fascinating, because it tries to restore that. The Stoic tries to restore your sense of wonder in how things are actually alive. And I have to share a funny story. I live in a university town. There's not so many of us here. And I was out, it's funny, on our local ski lift a few years ago with a planetary scientist.
Wow.
And I said, all this science is great, but nobody really knows where life comes from. He said, oh, that's not so hard. I said, oh, really? Okay. He said, it's cycles of heat and cold. They contract, they condense, and they generate life. I said, do you really believe that? Like, really? I mean, has that ever actually been done before? And this guy, he already had it all figured out. So book 2 is really trying to say, that we could all be atoms in the void, but how are we thinking and moving? And how am I moving my fingers? I'm not even aware I'm doing this, right? Let me ask you, based on your lawyer's experience, what would it mean to have the first philosophy, basically the atheist philosophy, present its view, and then cross-examined by the second philosophy, Stoicism? And then the third philosophy, skepticism, cross-examined stuff, but nobody cross-examined skepticism. What would that mean to you if you did this?
Oh, man. Well, I mean, the big danger there would be they would all be talking past each other. I guess, yeah, it's these types of debate. I mean, look, there's different schools of thought. There are some people that think that theological discussions like this ultimately don't change anyone's mind. Everyone leaves the door the way they go into the door. But I don't agree with that. I think just by talking about these things, it helps us clarify our own thoughts. It helps us really learn about human psychology. It helps us learn about the human experience, how we interact with the universe. So honestly, I found that this book, going through this cross-examination process that you just described, I found this to be the most rewarding and difficult of all of the Ciceronian treatises that I've dealt with. It's because, and the reason is because you are forced to contend with ideas that you might have an aversion to, but it kind of helps you clarify your own thought. And you don't really understand everything until you get to the end and you really start to think about it. I think that each book really lays out a very, very good articulation of each philosophy. And there are some passages of real beauty in book 2, in the Stoic conception, where he really talks about the movement of the wandering stars, the planets, obviously, down to the actual corporeal level of the human body, the operation of the throat, and the the ears and the nose, and the argument, Balbus basically says that this all had to be done for a purpose. There must be some purpose. We were endowed with reason, and we must have used it. So it's in many ways, it's a very comforting, it's a very beautiful conception, and it really makes you wonder. Some people I think I've read this before. There are some people that have commented that Stoicism, the ethics, has a lot in common with Buddhism, classical Buddhism, and it may even have been true. We don't really know that. The original Stoic thinkers, Zeno, Carneades, Chrysippus, they came from either Cyprus or Asia Minor. They may have had. It's possible that these ideas may have trickled out of northern India and maybe into the Near East sometime in antiquity, and maybe influenced the current of ideas through trade and commerce. And we don't know. We don't really know. But it's a fascinating thought. But even Epicureanism, for all of its look, Cicero was always very careful to distinguish the philosophy from the man. He had the highest respect for Epicurus as an individual. He led there's an old saying that Epicurus was no Epicurean. He actually led a very abstemious life. He was a very honorable man. He was, in many ways, he was almost like a monkish. He led a very monkish existence. The problem is that his philosophy really could only be practiced by the very elite. I mean, the level of discipline that it would have taken to really practice Epicureanism the way it was intended is not something that the average guy can really maybe wrap his mind around. It takes a very, very high level of discipline.
That's where I think maybe you would agree. The Stoic philosophies, the coping mechanisms of Stoicism are pretty unparalleled, right? Those are for the average person. We screw up, we lapse. I'm going to have my iron discipline till about 6 p.m. and now the cupcake is calling in the other room. And so the Stoicism has the forgiveness aspect to try and help you get past that. You're hitting some of the high notes that I had been thinking about when I was reading, but I want to ask you about a question. And maybe I can read this quote that I pulled out from your translation here, because you were just talking about reason, right? And the philosophers all in the ancient world say this, but especially Cicero says this here. Reason distinguishes us from animals and so on. But there's this amazing argument that the skeptic speaker makes. Is reason a good thing? Is it evidence that we human beings are like the God's chosen species of all the animals? And Cicero seems to say it isn't. So here's a quote. He says, "So too may a grievous moral offense be committed with the aid of reason." They say evil, crime, right? The former path is followed by few and infrequently. This is what you're saying. While the latter route is chosen by many and often. This being the case, it would have been better that no reason at all had been given to us by the immortal gods than that it would have been given with such pernicious consequences. And my takeaway from this is Cicero seems to be saying he doesn't believe in like the insanity defense. When people commit crimes, we know we're doing it. We're calculating. I'm going to break into the museum and steal the Picasso. That's not happening like an epileptic seizure. I can only do that because of reason. And he says it's actually a curse on human beings. What did you think of that when you were translating?
I totally agree with you, Michael. I found those passages in the third book are some of the most profound and I think important in the whole treatise, because I think my view, or what I think Cicero is trying to tell us, and he uses as always, he uses a wealth of examples from drama, from poetry, and from history to basically tell us that reason alone is not enough. We need enlightened reason. It needs to be buttressed by a moral sense, because I think what he's trying to tell us is that this Stoic fixation, and in many ways there was a real aridity to Stoicism, a very detached, a very pedantic, hair-splitting nature to Stoicism. It doesn't come across in this book, but in some of his other books on moral ends, and especially in Tusculan Disputations, this idea that there are no degrees of virtue. You're either virtuous or you're not, and even if you study virtue for 15 years, if you do one little, you could not have progressed at all. And this is, and I think this sort of pedantry, this Stoic pedantry was something that Cicero objected to, because he had to deal with the real world. He had to try cases. He had to deal with politics. He had to deal with negotiation. And I think this Stoic idea of reason, and I think this is something that Voltaire picked up on in Candide, as we've talked about, this idea. Well, I think where one of the characters, I think, said, boy, the world is so perfect. My nose was perfectly constructed to hold my glasses. What an amazing, perfect world this is. And this was something that Voltaire mocked. And I think Cicero also anticipated him in this mockery, that, look, reason is great, and it's fine, and it's wonderful. And it's certainly, but there are a lot of evil people in the world, Michael. There are a lot of malicious, vindictive dictators in Roman history, and consuls who were bloodthirsty tyrants who slaughtered their opponents. And frankly, how can we believe in a divine providence if these malicious, horrible, evil people were given the gift of reason? The reality is, the truth is, that there is no divine providence, Kata suggests, and that we're on our own. And then it's up to you, it's up to us, it's up to you and I to use our reason in a moral, socially responsible way to honor the gods. Because as Cicero says, as you remember, I think we've talked about this, no man ever gave credit to the gods for being a good man. No one ever woke up and said, boy, I'm a virtuous man. It's all because of it. No, because they know that virtue has to be earned by yourself. We give thanks to the gods for a bountiful harvest, or maybe financial successes, or successes in jobs. But Cicero makes it, and I thought this was a very good point, that no good man ever gave thanks to the gods for acquiring virtue. I thought that mattered. Yeah. Maybe you think so.
Absolutely. That's one of the most profound passages. That one has really haunted me. It's funny. I've got a friend who used to say the same thing in different words. He says, some people say they hear voices telling them to do horrible things. Nobody ever seems to hear voices saying, kiss your wife, kiss your wife. Right. You take credit for that, right? You say, no, I know I'm doing that. You have two themes that I want to talk about, at least briefly. One is Voltaire, which is a name that a lot of us may not have even heard, or it's a name others have heard but don't know much about. But before we get to Voltaire, I wanted to get back to what you just talked about, the humor in the book. This book has hilarious moments, and you would never know it with a title like On the Nature of the Gods. That's what Cicero calls it. You wouldn't know that this thing is funny. I pulled out one, but there must be at least a dozen witty little exchanges here. Where did it go? Let me find it. Here we go. Okay. Here's what a little note I made to myself. A lot of people, when they read this book, some people might even feel kind of blasphemous, or even like they're going to go to hell for even reading this book, much less writing something like this. But Cicero not just writes this stuff, he actually makes fun of it. He makes a joke about Dionysius, the tyrant of Syracuse, his favorite god. And one of the things that is in book 3, Dionysius goes and robs a temple. Now, in the ancient world, that's the worst thing you could do. They call you a sarcophagus, because the temples had all the treasures. So you're not only robbing the bank, but you're also robbing God. And so you get in big trouble for that. But he goes in, he robs a temple, and he sails home. And he said, this is your translation, he said with a laugh, "Do you see, my friends, how pleasant a voyage is given by the immortal gods to men who have committed sacrilege?"
Yeah.
And there are other cases that, they've got this guy named Diagoras the atheist. They call this guy Theos, which means the godless. That's pretty bad. And they're out at sea, and there's a huge storm, and the ship starts listing like crazy. And everybody says, "Let's throw the atheist overboard." And he says, "Look at the other ships. Do you think look at the Diagoras on board too?"
Right. Well, the Dionysius. You remember the anecdote there where I think he robs. There's a cloak. Apparently, these temples had big statues, and there was one that had a cloak, and I guess the cloak was like gold encrusted with gold overlays or jewels. And he said, well, it's winter, he doesn't really need this cloak, so I'm going to relieve him of this burdensome. He needs a woolen cloak, so he took the gold one off and replaced it with a woolen one. And I think also one of the gods, I think it may have been Apollo, had a beard, And he said, there's no reason for his father had was clean shaven, so there's no reason for him to have a beard. So I'm going to remove that too. So yeah, these are humorous anecdotes, but there's a real. I think the lesson is that, look, I think what he's trying to say is that there are many people in the world who commit foul deeds, and not only do they are not punished, but they seem to prosper.
Yeah.
And this can be very, and it's, at least for me, I don't know about you, but when I got to this point in the book, the shift in gears was very startling, and it was almost like Cicero got very dark. Like there was you could almost feel the despair, the negative. I don't not to say negativity, but you could feel the real anguish in this. Why is it that my good friend was proscribed? Why is it that he's, how can we say that the world is governed by a divine providence when evil not only is not punished, it flourishes, and good men are tossed by the wayside? And look, these are very profound questions. It's the so-called problem of evil, and it almost
Let me ask you
makes you feel like he was, really wrestling with his daughter's death. And I felt like I felt the weight of the burden of Tullia's death in these passages. Maybe you did too, Michael. I don't know.
That was exactly what I wanted to ask you about. So you could mention here, you say it in the introduction, but his daughter had just died just before this. She died in childbirth. She was, I think, 32 years old. The light of his life, as you know, he extols her in all of his letters. And so he's trying to grasp what I think is generally seen as one of the most difficult things in all of human existence, the death of a child. And so he writes this book. I agree. The tone of 3 does veer into some really dark stuff here. Along those lines, before maybe we open it up to some questions from the audience, I wanted to ask you a little bit about Voltaire. So just for some background, Voltaire, many of you may know, was sort of the greatest writer of the French Enlightenment. So you're talking about 18th century. An extraordinary writer. Nobody reads much of any of his stuff today other than Candide, which is a magnificent short little novel you can read. But Voltaire, and you mentioned it in here, Voltaire called this one of the 2 greatest books ever written.
Yeah.
What do you think he was getting at? Why would he say so? I mean, that is really saying something coming from Voltaire.
Yeah. Well, Michael, I think that Voltaire, you're right. He's not read today, but I think it's only because, well, he was, as you know, as you said, he was a playwright, poet, philosopher, even a historian of the Enlightenment, probably one of the most influential writers in European history. But people would ask, well, how come we don't read any? Well, I think the reason why we don't read him today is, I think, because the demons that he slayed so completely that we don't really need to contend with them anymore. I mean, remember, this was the one that he basically, his real anger was directed against the clerical establishment. He in his day, the influence of the church was very, very stifling in his view, and it needed to be oxygenated with a breath of reason and fresh air. And now we can argue that the French philosophes and the Age of Reason, and there was a whole slew of these guys, they maybe went too far and they maybe placed too much faith in reason. This is an argument that students of philosophy can certainly have. But I think what attracted, in my view, Voltaire and many of the Enlightenment thinkers like Benjamin Franklin and many others was Cicero's the rationalist tone of all of Cicero's writings. There's a very, very conscious rationalist tone, and this comes across in so many things in the book. For example, there's even derivations of words. Cicero will, in this book, he'll talk about the names of the gods, and well, Ceres came from the word for grain, and Diana came from the word. I mean, this is for I think the first time that I've seen in history where someone is actually using reason to actually study religion in a rationalist way. And he'll say, well, this god, there's an analogous form of this god in Egypt, and there's 3 different versions of Hercules. There's an Indian one, there's an Egyptian one. I mean, to put these types of this type of intellectual thought in this really takes an expansive intellect, I think. And I think that was something that Voltaire could have been attracted to. And I think because Voltaire was not necessarily, he was not an atheist. I think he did have a belief in a sort of a divine power, but beyond that, I don't think he really felt that he could say much about it. And I think that's really where the question we always come to, well, what did Cicero himself believe in? And again, we can debate this, but in my view, I think he did have a belief in a divine architect, but I think it was a Platonic view that placed sort of this demiurge, universal creative force, which emanated the lesser gods, which then in turn created the physical world. But I think beyond that, I don't think we could really say very much about it. But he certainly had a very utilitarian view of religion as a social good and a social necessity for keeping society glued and lubricated. So that's
a lot of food for thought. I agree with you, by the way. I think,
but these views are not shared by everyone, and that's the beauty of it. We can certainly, reasonable minds can agree to disagree, and I think this is really where we get into studies of comparative religion, human psychology. But I think we can certainly say that there's been no society that I'm aware of that's ever existed without some form of religion.
That's what Cicero says in the first few pages. He's, how do we know the gods exist? Well, there are, you can find the rare atheist here or there, but pretty much anybody you've ever met, they all have an idea of the gods.
Yeah.
Of course, the argument gets attacked later on and so forth. Anya, should we open it up to questions from the audience a little bit? While we're thinking about that, I'm going to be bringing this onto the syllabus of my Introduction to Ancient Rome course at Cornell. If I don't teach it next year, it'll definitely be the next year, so the year after. But the first iteration I get, we're going to be reading this. Fantastic job you did with it, really.
Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I found it really readable. I mean, I think that's the nice thing about having new translations and the importance of having constant translators and making these works stay alive by allowing them to access modern readers. Now, I would like to ask a question actually that was submitted in advance. And it was one of my readers had a bit of took up umbrage with the fact that I had put on the nature of gods Cicero and philosophical approaches to God. And they're like, oh, no, you can't. That's a monotheistic approach to this. But this is actually something in the book. Can we use the word God or gods when having this discussion?
Michael, you want to address that, or you want me?
George, you translated the book. That's really yours.
Okay. Well, this is a very, very good question, Anya, and it's a very troubling question because, and I've talked about this with Michael. Cicero almost interchangeably uses the singular and plural form of God. In the text, you'll find Deus, and then you'll find Dei or Dei. And so the question then, the question, so what do you believe in a monotheism or polytheism or a mixture of both? And this is my answer, my response to that, and I talked about this in the introduction. I think there's two things we have to keep in mind with when approaching this issue. I think it's perfectly acceptable to use in the book. I'll just say in my practice has been to translate the word literally as I find it in the original Latin text. I do not impose my own singularity or plurality on the word. I faithfully record it and let the reader decide for himself or herself how they want to interpret that. Now, having said that, I think we need to keep in mind that in the ancient world, religion was not, this was before the age of the great monotheistic faiths. This was before the advent of Christianity, of Islam. I mean, Judaism was not very well known. It was confined to a very small geographic area. So the ancients did not have such a rigid view, a rigid drawing line between monotheism and polytheism as we do today. Yes, there is some in Egypt, things in certain historical periods were different, but they believed, I think, more in a continuum of gods, whereas there was sort of a panoply of different divine manifestations, all emanating from a some possibly a singular source. That's one point. I think the second point is Cicero was also he was a Platonist. I mean, ultimately Plato was the biggest influence on him, and he may have subscribed to Plato's view articulated in the Timaeus, Plato's dialogue, where there was an emanationist view of creation and of the physical world. In other words, you had a divine architect, a demiurge at the top, which emanated these lesser gods, which in turn then created the physical world. Now, this was this is a very complicated. I'm shortening it obviously for our purposes here, but if we look upon it that way, then it almost makes no difference whether we use the singular form or the plural form, because all of the gods are essentially manifestations of the same divine essence. So I think these are the things we have to keep in mind. But it is you're right, it is very disconcerting. There are some very mysterious things in this book, and Mike and I have talked about it. The last sentence, for example, or one of the last few sentences. I mean, so the third book just really tears into Stoicism and gives a very slashing attack, and then at the end, Cicero seems to pull it all away and say, well, I listened to all three of them, and I felt like the presentation by Balbus was the most closest closest likeness to the truth. Well, what are we supposed to make of that? I mean, what do we do? Was this Cicero's view himself? I mean, what did he believe in? Or is he telling us that even though I don't really believe in the Stoic cosmology and the theology, it's better off that we think it's true anyway, because it's a social good. It's better that we believe in it, even if it's not true. I don't know. I mean, I'm throwing these ideas up, and I don't think we may never know. But I think it's something that's worth thinking about and discussing.
Now, speaking of religion, there's another good question of what was at stake for Cicero in defining the term religion and referring to religion rather than the gods?
Well, we have to remember, Anya, that religion in the Roman world, and especially in the Roman state, was very, very structured. Was in fact it was almost a component of the state. It was an arm of basically the government. It was a state religion. In many ways, it was almost like Shintoism. Again, these are very crude analogies, but Shintoism under the former Japanese imperial system before 1945. So Cicero had the highest respect for religion as an institution. Now, whether he believed in the reality of the gods or the ultimate, unknowability of the divine essence, that's something we can talk about. I think we have to get comfortable. It's important for us, and I think readers of this book need to be comfortable with the idea that a philosopher can believe in two different things simultaneously. He can have a very practical view, and this is not something that I made up, but there are even medieval philosophers that believe the same thing, that you can have a belief in religion as a social good and as a social necessity, and at the same time probably not swallow all of the theological architecture of the religion. And I think profound thinkers understand that humans need myths, they need fables, they need these allegories, they need these myths to impart moral lessons. These things survive not because the priests command them, but because the people want them. Every time societies have tried to abolish religion or restrict it, it's always come back stronger. And this is not because, and the anti-religion people, I think, are very, very short-sighted in this respect, because they don't understand human nature. And this is why no one is ever, in my view, no one is ever going to listen to atheists for much longer than it takes to listen to a seminar, because at the end of the day, it doesn't fulfill the human need for comfort and bereavement during severe personal loss, during anguish, during times of hardship. These these stories and myths and fables and rituals of religion all exist for a certain purpose. And I think the wise thinker will understand them and will not interfere with them. Leave them alone. Let them be. Do not attack the state religion. Do not attack religion too much, because when you do that, what you're doing is you're stripping away from people the things that give meaning to their lives, and it's very cruel. So I think that's now this. He never comes out and says this, but the early Christian, and I talk about this in the intro, the early Christian apologists, Lactantius, Arnobius, they were pretty smart. They understood what Cicero was getting at. They knew he wasn't fooling them. He wasn't fooling them at all. They knew that he didn't believe literally in the fables of mythology, but they understood. And this is why they embraced him. I think in some ways the Christian fathers recognized a kindred spirit. Well, I'm going to get into trouble for some of these things, but I think they recognized a kindred spirit when they read him, and this is why his writings survived and the others did not.
It is very interesting, the role of religion, as you mentioned in the introduction, both from Cicero saying that it needed to be upheld, and then Benjamin Franklin as well, that they kind of had this role. And even just personally, I've been traveling through Georgia and Armenia of late, last time I talked to you guys, and like that is certainly a place where religion, Christianity in particular, is so important and was in such conflict during the Soviet Union. So it's interesting to see that these things are ancient and still relevant in our modern era. But to switch sort of from religion to the superstitious, this one's from Christian. Cicero and deviation and augury is super interesting. How would this view contrast to Caesar's?
Well, Mike, do you want to handle that, or do you want me to?
The question is, how would Cicero's view contrast with Julius Caesar's? Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, I don't think we know much about Julius Caesar's personal views. Some people say he's an Epicurean, although that's mostly based, if I'm not mistaken, on a single speech in Sallust, who was a historian who knew Julius Caesar. But I think when you look at the historical record of what Julius Caesar did, it doesn't take much to think he was not afraid of the gods. Right? I mean, he seemed to be, well, you mentioned Napoleon earlier there, George. I mean, Caesar was basically the same. There's the episode where Caesar loots the state treasury, right? And the tribunes in Rome were sacrosanct, and one stands in front of the door, and Caesar's back in the Civil War, and he says, "You're not getting in over my dead body." And Caesar said, "All right, we'll go with the dead body then, if you don't get out of the way." And so he was a man who did not seem to scruple much about the gods.
No, these were men of action. These were not Caesar. No, Caesar had a first-rate intellect. Anyone that's read on the Gallic work can sense a very first-rate, profound intellect. But he was not an intellectual in the sense of a. I mean, Cicero really devoted a significant part of his life to studying philosophy, writing about it. He really was, a bona fide philosopher. Caesar was more of a practical. He was a different kind of person. I mean, he was just as intelligent, if not more. We can debate that, but it was a different kind of. It was a very. He had the ability to assess a problem and craft solutions in a matter of seconds. He could see, just like Napoleon or a lot of other, maybe Thomas Edison. He could see right through to the heart of an issue, and I mean, there are accounts of him dictating like 4 letters simultaneously. I forget where that's from, but I think maybe it was Plutarch that said that. But he was but I think how we have to understand Cicero is and his views on divination is that and religion is that he was first and foremost concerned with social order and stability. He grew up in a time of severe social turbulence and chaos and civil war. He himself had to flee Rome at one point in his youth, where this was what really mattered to him. And he was basically a conservative individual. He was a member, even though he did not come from an aristocratic background, he was of the conservative party. And he felt that it was the duty of a citizen to obey the law and to behave in socially responsible ways. Now I think this is how we have to come at this from a starting point. But having said all that, he does have what we do detect in all of his writings is a very curious, wide-ranging, engaging intellect. He liked to test ideas and weigh them and chew on them and sort of weigh them in the balance and see how. Again, he was basically an eclectic and a skeptic. He thought that we should try to take from each school the ideas that we thought worked and discard the ones that did not.
Let me add one little point just on that. You know, you sparked a memory. Lucan has this poem, The Civil War, and there's an episode. It's based on history, so it's probably based on an account we don't have. The soldiers were up in the north of Italy or in southern France, and there was this old ancient forest. And Caesar said, "Go chop down those trees. We need them for the fort." And they said, "No, we can't." And they're hung with like trophies and everything, and they're all sacred. And Caesar said, "All right," and took the axe and he chopped the first one down himself. He said, "All right, you guys can do the rest." So that tells us probably how he approached divination. Would be my.
It has the ring of truth. Oh yeah, you can see that happening. Oh yeah.
Now, you were mentioning about Cicero being an eclectic, and I think this is really interesting because, you know, with the involvement of a lot of Stoic groups right now and modern Stoicism, this becomes regularly sort of a debate when it comes to how to deal with Stoicism, because there are so many popular elements and of how to handle trauma and anxiety and anger that people really like. But then when it comes to sort of dealing with the cosmology and some of the other structural elements of Stoicism as it was practiced back in the ancient world, you know, that doesn't make it into the Ryan Holiday books, to be frank. But how would Cicero feel about that? I mean, is it okay to cherry pick religion? Is it okay to look at Epicureanism and Stoicism and skepticism, say like, you know what, I like that element, but I can leave the rest to the edge?
Well, Anya, I guess it depends on what level of a purist you are. I'm sure there are people that would object to that approach and feel that it does a disservice to the integrity of the doctrines, which should be considered as a whole. And there's certainly much validity to that view, I think. But on the other hand, my view is this: it's kind of like the professor who, you know, is faced with the question, okay, well, should I recommend the Cliff Notes version of this novel to my students, or should I think you should put it all out there. I think you look, the students, people are gonna cherry pick no matter what you do. They're gonna read the dumbed down version of Epicureanism or Stoicism. They're gonna read the pop books about Stoicism. And my feeling is, let them read. If it helps to open the door to further treasures, who am I to, you know, so be it. That's always a good, the true seekers will always find their way to the original sources. So my view on you is, I think Cicero would have said this, because I feel like I know him I feel like I know him well enough to almost feel like I can maybe speak for him. Maybe he would have said, it's better that you start off with what you have at hand. And even in Cicero's day, I think it was Michael. I think it was even Tusculan Disputations. He talks about earlier attempts to convey Greek philosophy to the Roman audience. He criticizes these books as being very childish and very the same criticisms we have of the airport books, the airport Stoic books, the pop light Stoic book. He was leveling against his predecessors. So, you know, my feeling is, hey, look, get in there and compete. If you think you can do better, you go in there, you put it out there, you put your book out there, and you see what takes or doesn't take. At the end of the day, the reader will decide, the consumer will be the one to decide. And I think that I always think that people should try to read as widely as possible, and they should read as much as they can. But you know, if reading a pop Stoic book helps them to, you know, to begin their educational odyssey, that's great. I think that's fantastic. If reading the Cliff Notes version of Don Quixote helps, or Moby Dick. I think they should do that. I think you should read it all. I think you should. I think that you have a responsibility to get up to speed on as much as you can get your hands on. Yeah.
Mike, would you add to that?
No, I'll back you up. I think people should go. We should read both. And I was laughing when you said that about the Tusculan disputations because I never thought about that. But yeah, he says he trashes these Amathenius.
I can't remember the names of them. They're very yeah.
You don't have that stuff, but he says read the real thing. No, I'm in agreement on that point, Anya.
Now, getting into some more of the historical elements, what is the relationship between Cicero's work and Lucretius?
Well, so I can speak to that if you want. There's a famous letter Cicero has where he talks about Lucretius. It's to his brother Quintus, if my memory serves, and he says the guy wrote this poem. It's full of I'm getting the amount of time on art. I'm trying to quote he says it's full of a lot of art and a lot of intellectual brilliance, more or less. And you can't tell from the way he's phrased it whether that's a ringing endorsement or a qualified endorsement. But that's the only reference we have to him. Lucretius would be familiar to a whole lot of us on this call, I think, right? Because it's this towering epic poem about about Epicurean physics, or what you would almost call metaphysics, but they don't really have that. But the big hole in that hole, and the hole is the gods. And every ancient philosophy had a systematic treatise of the gods. And so Cicero, with this work, seems to be plugging the gap a little bit there, trying to come up with something that makes sense for them. But I think that's all we can say about their own particular relationship.
Yeah, Michael, you know a lot more about this than I do. I mean, this is really what, maybe you can help me, because this is something I've always wondered regarding Lucretius. Why is it that Roman literature seems to be so silent about this, like you said, this towering figure? It's one of the great, as you said, didactic poems in history, maybe the greatest, but yet there's just very little. Other writers don't seem to refer to. Do you think maybe the manuscript was not copied or not circulated maybe as widely as, or was it considered so profane or so out there that, it's always been kind of a mystery to me. What do you think?
So I have my own pet theory. Everybody likes a good crank theory on the internet. Here it goes. So number one, we know that people were reading Lucretius not because they talk about it, but because all the other poets that came after have allusions and reuses of poetic phrases from Lucretius. And it's pretty clear they're coming from there. It has been argued, I thought rather ingeniously, I don't know if it's right or not, that Virgil's Aeneid was a response to Lucretius. He tried to reimpose fear of death within book 6 of the Aeneid, where there's this voyage down to the underworld, and it's scary as hell. But the real reason, remember, is that in Epicureanism, the great mantra is "Lathe biosas," which is Greek for "live in obscurity." And so if you're good, the better the Epicurean you are, the less we know about you.
Wow.
Right. So the more orthodox you are, I find it absolutely fascinating. We have no idea how many people were Epicureans for the very reason.
That's a great point. I think I read somewhere recently that in Herculaneum or Pompeii, this the Villa of the Papyri, this book. I think we know that people were reading these texts because I think a lot of the texts that have been discovered were Epicurean, right? Greek Epicureans or Latin. Most of the writings I think are in Greek, but yet like you said, it's very there's a lot that we just don't know, and that's what's really so tantalizing about ancient history and literature. There's just so much that we just have to try to make inferences from. It's just incredible.
But we do have enough. We have a lot of whole stock stuff. That's why I'm excited that you're doing this stuff. We don't have to read the fragments in Herculaneum. We can actually read the real essays. We got them.
Well, I think actually that's actually a good point for us to finish up on, because I know some of you guys have to run. And I do want to say that if you are interested in Stoicism and Epicureanism and skepticism, it's almost like a one-stop shop to understanding a lot of it, which I think is just really, really valuable, especially as people are getting more and more interested in these ancient philosophies. I'm really grateful to you, George, for putting out this translation so people can get even more into it and understand it at another level.
Oh, thank you, Anya. Thank you for having me, Michael. And I just want to say, Dr. Fontaine has been a very continuous and encouraging voice of support and encouragement. And I relied on his guidance and suggestions on many a fork in the road. So I want to thank him and recognize his true greatness of soul, magnitudo animi, which is another one of Cicero's phrases. I mean, it really takes an expansive spirit to reach out to an unknown person, and so I just wanted to express my gratitude to that publicly here. So, and you also, Anya, thank you.
Well, I'm going to say thank you, guys. Just as a little note of housekeeping, I'm going to send through an email with the recording for all of those who weren't able to join us live. I know we have a very international audience, and I could see some of the Australians joining us at 2 a.m. out of sheer love, dedication. I want to appreciate that. I will send through links to the book as well, so everyone can get their own copy. And for those who enjoy classical wisdom events, our next one is called The Story of Thebes. We will be looking at Thebes from a mythological, archaeological, historical, literal, and military way. We've got a whole interesting panel that will be in the follow-up email as well, so everyone can join us. That's on October 11th, so we can go from the gods to Theban. Well, they had gods then too. So I want to say thank you again to George and to Mike and to everybody who joined us today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Real pleasure.
Thank you. Ciao.